Wednesday. Happy Peikoff Wednesday. Thank you for joining us for Keeping It Real, because that's what me and James Valliant are doing. We are keeping it real and working through Leonard Peikoff's outstanding podcast answers that were compiled into this outstanding volume, Keeping It Real. James Valliant, how are you doing today?
I am doing outstandingly today. I really am. I'm feeling great. We're moving now into a whole different section of Dr. Peikoff's book here. One that I have to admit right up front that I have studiously been avoiding, and for various reasons. I have spoken with Dr. Leonard Peikoff about a great many topics, and I know I'd like to share my personal experience on these podcasts, but I am not a parent. I simply don't have that kind of experience, nor have I spoken to children and parenting much with Dr. Peikoff. And so while I can talk about the philosophical aspects of it, and look, I've been a kid, I have parents, I was at that side of the experience, but it's totally different than the actual experience of raising a child. And so I'd want to recommend the other work that is done here at Ayn Rand Center UK. Very, very important work by people, psychologists and parents and educators, people who really have much better experience in this than I do, this area. But I did want to say up front, I'm not a parent, and I haven't really spoken about this issue with Dr. Peikoff. So I want to put a big disqualifier on that. Someone like Lisa Van Dam, who does the Joy of Parenting series for the Ayn Rand Center UK. She has been an educator for decades. She's a parent herself. I think she's much more eminently qualified to give us detailed advice on this sort of thing. Peikoff is both a philosopher and a parent, and so his ideas are great, but I just wanted to put that big disqualifier here. I also, before we get started, I want to make a correction. Boy, did I get it wrong. I mean, those friends I mentioned who attend dating apps, boy, I got the swiping exactly backwards.
Oh, the left and
the right. I could have been more wrong about that. I wanted to put official correction in on that as well. So it's a kind of a bummer to start the whole thing with my correction and my saying, this guy doesn't really know what he's talking about. But I will do what I can here. I really will.
Well, James, as more so than usual, I'm going to count on you, not as much for your experience as your wisdom. Usually you bring the experience into the equation. Today, it's going to be all about the wisdom. I've got the experience. I have a beloved daughter, my heart in another person's body. So I have a little bit of experience with that, but you are right. Folks, once we have finished this conversation today, if you want more on parenting, on the joy of parenting, definitely take a look at Lisa Van Dam's Enjoy Parenting series on the ARCUK. You can find the playlist just by searching on the channel, or go to my Facebook wall, my most recent comment, Robert Nasir, facebook.com/Robert Nasir. You'll see a link to the Lisa Van Dam Enjoy Parenting series, and also a Substack that you've got to be signed up for, which is Gina Gorlin. Now, if you know Gina Gorlin, she is doing the Founders series. She is looking at what makes founders of large corporations the people that they are. But on the same Substack, she and Matt Bateman are now talking about raising their children. She just had her second child. Substack is available to you to follow. I'm not giving any inside information here. Take a look at that. Again, links are at facebook.com/Robert Nasir. Matt Bateman, at the same time, founder, leader of Montessori schools. There are two different nationwide Montessori organizations, whole networks of schools founded by Objectivists. So yes, when people say, well, Ayn Rand, I don't know, she wasn't about kids, or some people go so far as to say Ayn Rand hated kids. No. And the connections between rational life and rational parenting, well, that's what we're going to talk about.
Yes, so many. In fact, I would have to say most of my friends who are objectivists or fans and students of Ayn Rand are parents. And they love it, and it's one of the ultimate joys of their lives, I have to say. And no. Objectivism has a very, very high value on the role of parents and the importance of education. And that's why so many objectivists are interested in things like Montessori education and so forth. They regard parenting and child rearing as an extremely important value. So they get the wrong idea about Ayn Rand if they think we're anti-kid. And that is
Absolutely.
really, it's one of the bum raps objectivism gets, because Ayn Rand didn't have kids. But that's a valid choice too.
It is. And that's why I love that we've got this network of schools, but also all of these families. It just, if you get a chance to meet any objectivist parents, if you're not one yourself, you got to meet these kids. It's kind of like when Ayn Rand writes about kids in the Valley. I don't want to give spoilers, but she talks about kids in just this way. These young, rational isn't even the right word, because it doesn't even occur to them to be irrational. They weren't raised to be irrational. They're just eyes wide open and taking in the world, and that adventurous spirit, which is the best of what we all remember from our own childhoods and what we love to see in our own children. So
Right.
Outstanding. We've got some comments already in the chat. Apollo Zeus is in the house. Greg Girlnick has comments as well and says, well, why didn't Ayn Rand and Frank O'Connor have children? We may talk about that. But a super chat from Walter, thank you very much for that. If you put in a super chat, if you put a couple dollars in your comment or question, Walter just put it in there without a question, but it'll make it stand out. It'll show us some love, but it all goes to support the Ayn Rand Center UK. So let me say from the outset, we are on the Ayn Rand Center UK channel. Outstanding programming, outstanding study groups, so many things. If you want to join, if you want to become a member, click the link at the top of the chat. You know what to do. Do the right thing. Spike Lee would approve. So I'm going to jump right to our first question, because there's so much more we could talk about, and we will. But Leonard Peikoff was asked this, and this relates to a question we talked about last week. You know, if to love is to value, is the idea of unconditional love a fallacy? Leonard Peikoff quite rightly said, well, yes, it is. Unconditional love is a contradiction in terms. If it's unconditional, it's not valuing, it's not loving. He does say in his answer, though, there's a partial exception to that, and that is the parent-child relationship. Well, we talked about that last week, but there's a further question that he was asked during his podcasts, and it's not printed in the book because he pretty much covered it there. But he was asked, is unconditional love for a child irrational? How can a small child have the virtues required to deserve love?
Right. That's the whole theory of objectivist theory of love. It is the values and virtues of another person that I'm responding to.
Yes.
If it isn't the virtues, and with a human being, they're moral agents. Their virtue and their moral character is a critical, in fact, the essential thing that I'm responding to in a person. So how could a little child who's really not yet a developed moral agent at all be worthy of love?
Yes.
The big L love thing. And come on, parents love their kids in a way that they don't love anything else in the whole universe.
Yes.
So
yes, we talk about romantic love. True romantic love involves an irreplaceable value. Well, that idea of an irreplaceable value applies to children even more, I would say, than romantic love.
Yeah.
I've known parents who've lost a child, and it's like losing a limb. It's the worst thing in the world, and it's the greatest thing in the world when you've got it. So Leonard Peikoff is asked, is unconditional love for a child irrational? And Leonard Peikoff says, no. Unconditional love in those circumstances is certainly not irrational. It's fine. Well, what then has the child done? What is in him to deserve love? Now I'm going to stop Leonard Peikoff's answer here for a moment, just to say personally, I think this is one of those questions where there are multiple answers. And Leonard Peikoff's going to hone in on one very, very important one. But I'm going to lay it out here. My personal opinion, don't take this as Leonard Peikoff or objectivism, but there are several reasons why. And I want to give Leonard Peikoff's answer because this is an important one. Leonard Peikoff says, I think his value is being you. Well, being you in part, being created by you, reflecting what you are. And that's what you see in him. And he deserves love for that very reason. As he grows, as he makes choices, he achieves values, well, then your love reflects that. You have to remember that at an early age, in some significant part, the character he starts to form is due to you. So normal judgment at a very early stage is still not applicable. You can, as a parent, overlook flaws that other people objectively would have to condemn. You have to know, well, they're wrong, but that won't affect your feeling, your love, up to a point, but only that. And then he says, and I can't tell you where that point is. But here's how far he takes it. This is how he finishes up his answer. Once he's an adult and he goes beyond, let us say, venal sins to mortal ones, then you can only retain your love if you keep alive what he was at the beginning as a child. Now, that's not wrong, but you have to be careful about whether you act on that. So Leonard Peikoff is acknowledging even if a child does something objectively that would have an impact on your love for him, you're going to retain that sense of, but this is the person I created. This is the person I loved. It's not as simple as, oh, I shouldn't love you anymore.
You know, as a criminal prosecutor, I dealt with the parents of people accused of doing terrible, violent crimes. And mothers, I just have to, I think it's a cliche and everyone will know that your mother is your most diehard fan. She's going to be on your side to the very end. But I have even seen mothers who come to the point of realization that their son did some horrible thing. He did shoot the gun. He did assault the woman. He did do something terrible. And that moment of moral crisis, I've seen it go both ways. I've seen mothers go, I'm still going to defend him no matter what, come hell or high water. It's my little boy. And I've seen other mothers at that point quietly retreat and say, okay, let the process take its. And what a moral crisis it would be for a parent. Imagine a mother faced with that. And a lot of these women, obviously, in my view, the moral, decent women who I thought probably did a fine job. You know, it wasn't their fault that the kid came out a violent criminal, and they're the ones sort of acknowledging, okay, we got to let the process happen. Even they're the mother. But think about that as a moment. I witnessed that as a prosecutor, of that kind of a moment where the parent had to make a tough moral decision. And believe me, your mother's going to be your cheerleader to the last minute. She's going to be the diehard holdout. My little boy couldn't have possibly, or even if he did, I'm going to defend him. But there comes a point where we have to treat them like more adult moral agents. You can no longer enable, or you're joining him in his crimes. Yes. You cannot not let it affect your judgment of the person. You have to. Even you, mom, have to face the facts of reality when someone becomes an adult. And, that's part of the thing. Neither their horrible deeds nor their great achievements are really directly your doing in any event. And what's difficult for the parent is to separate that out. You could have done a fine job as a parent and still not really know how the kid's going to come out, because there are all kinds of other important factors. Free will is a factor, much less the background culture that you had nothing to do with. So, wow, what a great answer, actually.
It really is. And you're bringing in the full context there. You know, having to reach a point of finally morally condemning a child is almost like having a child die.
It is.
It's hard to imagine things worse than that.
Yeah.
They're out there, but it's hard to imagine. But we have this idea of unconditional love. You shouldn't judge. Obviously, you should. The intrinsicist idea. I think our conservative friends are more into that. Although it's pointed out in the chat that our socialist friends are also all about, don't judge people. People deserve stuff.
Adults. They would let adults off. Yeah. They wouldn't wait for the child who's morally. See, the charming thing when we were talking about unconditional love is pets, they're not moral agents. We can love pets completely. If they do something bad, we punish them and we're conditioning them. We're not, treating them and judging them like moral agents. With children, the charming thing about children is that they're becoming moral agents. And so those first lessons that they learn about life are actually charming. They don't reflect negatively on the child. They're in the process of growth, learning, development. And so it's like one of those old sitcoms where, father knows best or something, or Leave It to Beaver. The kid learns the life lesson and you're like, okay, you really can't blame the kid for having told the fib because they learned the Aesop's fable lesson there. And if they did learn it, if they did morally learn it, which was the theme of a lot of those sitcoms, he's like, all right. So you're patient with a child's moral development and moral learning in a way you're not patient and understanding with an adult, and don't have to be and shouldn't be. But as a parent can be, as Dr. Peikoff points out, even things that other people might say, well, that was an obnoxious thing for your kid to do. The parent is going to be patient with it. They're aware of the context and that this is still a developing moral agent.
Yes. So yes, our love for our children is I was going to say transcendent, just in the sense that it transcends the momentary judgments we would make with
Right.
other people. Similar to romantic love, we can excuse a lot until you reach a point where you can't. The reason why I mentioned intrinsicism is because I want to get into the second question here.
Right.
And how many times, I'll read this and the objectivists will say that's ridiculous, but how many times have you heard this question from people like Ben Shapiro, from people like, well, anybody on the conservative spectrum? Question number 2, isn't having a children a source of value in its own right, just as is your individual life? From a biological standpoint, the two seem to be of equal importance. Now, how many times have you heard people say, well, if everybody was like Ayn Rand and Frank O'Connor, the race would have died out because they didn't have any children? Yeah, there's this sort of feeling, this obligation that, oh, we got to propagate the species. We don't think of it that way, but we just think we need to have families, we need to have children, we need to, not like idiocracy where only the worst people.
Those conservative intrinsicists, they have a basis for it, right? And now they use biology and science as sort of the pseudo basis for it. But way back in Genesis, it says, be fruitful and multiply. Yeah. The first command of the Judeo-Christian God is to go make babies.
Go get busy.
And so Jews and Christians believe, hey, my first duty to God is to go reproduce. It's my duty to reproduce. That's built into Western religion, as you can see, all the way back to Genesis.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I couldn't resist bringing up Idiocracy because somebody recently paid Yaron Brook good money to review that film, and his review was, it's horrible. Horrible. I thought it was pretty funny. It was a clever premise and much better than Office Space, which is another film that Mike Judge wrote and directed. But yes, this idea of, objectivists, they don't want to have kids and therefore their philosophy isn't practical. So yes, isn't having a children a source of value in its own right, just as is your own individual life? And Leonard Peikoff says, quite rightly, value to whom? If I choose to have a child, then the child is a value to me. But if I choose not to have a child and one is foisted on me, well, it's a disaster, not a value. What would be the meaning of saying, well, it's a disaster for you, but, quote, life, unquote, likes it? Which life likes it? It's the same for, quote, important. Biology finds it important. To whom? Who the hell cares about biology? Biology is the name for the sum of what we know about living things. How can biology come in and say, well, now it's important? This person is taking a religious view. Individual desires, goals, and preferences are irrelevant. God stands up there and says, well, from the point of view of my cosmic plan, have kids. As you said, James, be fruitful and multiply. Leonard goes on, this is what we call intrinsicism. In other words, value is there whether anyone values it or not. It's a form of Platonism. And then he says parenthetically, it's interesting that this question uses floating abstractions, which are the essence of Plato's other world, life, biology, value. None of those are concretized.
Right. You'll notice the mystical way collectivists use the capital S society word.
Yeah.
And in this case, what they're using is the capital B biology word, as if somehow there's this greater abstraction out here, more important than our lives, that is dictating us. Oh, that is solid Plato, right? Solid nonsense, frankly. My wife and I don't have kids, as I said at the beginning. And my wife said something I think that is very, very relevant here. She loves children so much, she decided not to have them. When one chooses to have children, one needs to be dedicated to it like a career, as Ayn Rand said. Ayn Rand made this clear in her Playboy interview back in 1964. She regards parenthood as one of the most important careers. But on the other hand, she believed that parents should take it seriously like a career. If you don't want that kid, if you are not committed to having that kid, if you haven't chosen that kid. Now, another bit of my experience was as a criminal prosecutor. And for a few years, I prosecuted child neglect, child abuse, and I saw the effect of unwanted children being brought into this world. And, religious people can talk about the intrinsic value of family all they like, but sometimes family is not a pleasant thing. As much as family can be a wonderful thing, a family can be a trap that children need to escape from, a trap of physical or psychological abuse or neglect that they need to get the hell out of. So family, Mr. Conservative, is not an unlimited value. I can bring that experience to the table. Thank you very much. There are lots of abused and neglected children who are the product of not really being the selfish desire. And if you don't have this selfish desire, please don't become a parent. Please don't become a parent if it is not your conscious choice, because you need to dedicate yourself as you would to any other major goal, career goal, in effect, in your life, in bringing up this child that you brought into this world. So, look, I admire parents a great deal. They are doing one of the most important, I would use the word sacred functions, most sacred careers out there. My sister has 5 kids. She's got grandkids, and I love them to death. It's a wonderful thing that she's doing, but she is good at doing it. She wanted to do that. That was one of her principal goals in life, to do that. She set out scientifically to figure out child rearing education, child development psychology. She went about it rationally. I did not want to devote myself in that way. And, I would not compare myself to Ayn Rand because I think she contributed way more than I will ever possibly contribute to society. But on the other hand, that's not the standard. The standard is my happiness. My happiness. I would have been miserable had I done something that my wife didn't want to do, or done something that distracted me from my higher goals. And let me just suggest, although Ayn Rand did it and I'm doing it for perfectly selfish reasons, I know, at least in the case of Ayn Rand, she did far more good for the children of this world.
Yes.
Than if she'd had a dozen of her own.
Good grief. Yes. Yes. And you tell the story of your wife saying, yes, she's not going to have children because she takes her values, her life seriously, and because she wouldn't do that to a kid.
She loves children so much. Right?
It just makes me think of the young gal that Ayn Rand uses as an example of the folks who attended Woodstock in her outstanding talk, Apollo and Dionysus. And this gal is like, yeah, I think I'd like to have, maybe one child, just to procreate. And it sounds like a parody. It sounds like nobody could really say that. But how many people have you met in your life who you're like, why did you do this? Well, that's what people do. And that's just what happens. And on Saturday night at our last monthly get together, Great Lakes Objectivists, we were discussing the first essay in the recent release by the Ayn Rand Institute, Illuminating Ayn Rand, came out last fall. And the first essay is specifically taking ideas seriously. And obviously your wife is taking both ideas and values seriously. We had the honor of having Tom Bowden come in a Zoom session during the night and tell us more about that essay and how it all came together. Highly recommended if you haven't got that collection. It's a collection of essays that were published online on the New Ideal, Ayn Rand Institute's blog, but put together as a book. It makes an outstanding volume. Kind of like a lot of what you can get in this book, Keeping It Real, is available online, but when you put it in a book, oh my gosh, what a read. What a great read. So yes, taking values seriously often means saying, yeah, that's not a value in my life. And to drag that into my life, oh my gosh, that would be the exact opposite of a good thing. But speaking of children, and what can you do when you have to deal with children? Sounds like a quote. Question number 3. What is the basis? And this is going to be, and this is another one of those questions that kind of separates the wheat from the chaff. What is the basis for the rights of children? And how do these rights follow from an ethics of egoism? Is initiating force against a child immoral? Now, James, I've got to say, when I first read this question, of course, if initiating force against anybody is immoral, initiating force against a child is immoral. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, what about making them go to school, or
Yeah, don't we kind
spankings
of force kids
or,
around sometimes?
or pulling their hand away from the hot stove. And
Yeah.
Leonard Peikoff, of course, he didn't make that mistake in answering this at all. He says the basis for the rights of children is that they are human beings. They are not like embryos or fetuses. They're human beings, even if they don't yet have their full powers developed. The rights of children follow from an ethics of egoism, the same way all rights follow from an ethics of egoism. We survive by our own individual rational exercise and action, which is what the child will do. We have rights because we're born without obligation or duty, but simply with a moral obligation to serve our own welfare. As for force, here we go. Initiating force against a child is not immoral, even if the child has rights. It depends, of course, what kind of force, but you can't say, well, he has rights, liberty is a right, therefore he has a right to liberty, so let him do whatever he wants. Just turn him loose on the world. The child has no way to deal with the world as a child. You're responsible for him. It's up to you to discipline him, set limits, teach him. You can't say, oh, you don't feel like staying in your crib? Okay, go out on Fifth Avenue and enjoy yourself. The same is true for property. The child has no property rights. You can't give him a bunny, stuffed or real, and say, oh, this is yours. But if you find he's eating sections of either of them, a real bunny or a live one, stuffed one, then you take it away and you say, well, it's not yours anymore. The gift is conditional, so it's not actual property. And again, it's for the same reason. So force in the name of protecting the child is legitimate. Now, James, I thought of this and I thought, and that develops over the course of the child's life. As he reaches the age of majority, the conditional aspect of rights changes. And I know objectivists who bristle at that, who say,
Yeah,
no, I don't want it
too.
to be complicated. I want it to be like the libertarians do.
He makes a wonderful point here. Is reason not still the most basic tool of survival, even for a child? Well, of course. But reason, according to objectivism, is the basis for rights. If we were animals, if we didn't have a conceptual faculty, if we weren't highly developed conceptual creatures, we wouldn't need freedom. We wouldn't need rights. Rights are the product of the fact that freedom is the primary social condition required for the exercise of the human tool of survival, reason. But in a child, that faculty is still developing, and it's not fully developed until some point, until they're, they have to go through well into their teens before they're really in any meaningful sense, a moral agent in that sense. But it's through that process of development, we don't let them vote, we don't let them sign contracts, we let the parent force them around in many ways. No, you have to go to the doctor. No, you have to go to school. Yes, you have to wash behind your ears. All those things that mom and dad told us. Well, guess what? It's good for us. It's good for our development. We would be less, I am grateful for all of the discipline, let me put it this way, that my parents imposed on me. All of those bedtimes, all of those nutritional rules, sending me to school, getting me my vaccinations. My goodness, I may have cried the first time I got a vaccination, but I'm sure glad they put me through that. Because guess what? I was a dumb kid, and my well-being was better served, and my development as a rational being to become a fully moral agent was dependent on that. So no, while children are human beings, in every independent entities whose faculty of reason is their most fundamental tool of survival, therefore they have rights. On the other hand, their faculty of reason, the basis for their rights, isn't fully developed. And so that only kicks in over time as they develop and become fully rational moral agents.
Yes. Now,
Does that make sense?
Oh, it absolutely makes sense. And the reason I call on you as a lawyer is because you have seen by studying law how that affects the degree of a child's legal independence and what he can and can't do, and the limits, and this will be the next three questions, the limits in the context of what a parent can and can't do. Because how many times have we heard the state shouldn't educate our children because parents own their children? Well, certainly the state shouldn't educate our children, but then they can't understand a somewhat complicated situation. They just want to, no, the parents have unlimited control over the child. The parents own the child. I've even heard people say, in trying to argue against state education, the children are the property of the parents.
Right.
As a way to argue against them being
As
the
if they
property of
were
the state.
slaves or pets. Right.
So it's not a question of whether or not the kid is property, or whether or not the kid is property. It's just whose property. It's like, no.
Right.
So let's get a little bit into the flip side here. We're going to kind of bring the full context here. Question number 4, is it a crime for a parent not to care for her child? And using the word crime in the question, I think the questioner is setting us up for a challenge here, but Leonard Peikoff is going to answer this in principle. Leonard Peikoff says, a parent has a lot of choices. The first thing she has to recognize is that the child came about by her action. Whether she intended it or the birth control didn't work, it's not the child's problem. That child is a consequence of her action, and she is responsible for the results of her action. Egoism does not mean, well, you take an action and then say to hell with the consequences. It requires responsibility. The parent can put the child up for adoption, or could earlier have had an abortion, but to bring a real child into existence and then say, oh, to hell with it, let it die. Well, that is murder. It is no less than murder and should be a crime. There is where the child's right to life is the primary, and your maintenance of the child in the process of becoming a full human being is morally obligatory. That's the point in which he requires or acquires rights to liberty and property. When he's an independent entity, well, then he can go ahead and earn them himself. So very straightforward, very simple answer, but that's where people get hung up is, right. Well, I have this obligation that I didn't want. Yes, you do. Because you chose that. It'd be just the same as if you had signed a contract.
It is a chosen obligation. Now, objectivism is very keen on, emphasizing that there can be no unchosen obligations. But my goodness, when you do things that do cause something, you are responsible for it.
Yes.
In the case of parenthood, think about what you're doing. You're making a unilateral decision to bring another human being into this world, a human being that is incapable of taking care of itself for many years. This thing is a helpless thing. You didn't consult the child as to whether they wanted to be brought in. You unilaterally brought this thing into the universe, helpless, but an independent entity. A human being, and you brought them into this world. Well, no, you have an obligation to care for that child, and a legally enforceable obligation to care for that child. But that's why we as objectivists are regard it as a career decision, in effect, to have children. That's why we are in favor of legal birth control and legal abortion, because we want it to be a choice. But it doesn't matter whether it's a failure of birth control or anything else. If your actions brought into this world this helpless human being, you have a moral responsibility, and a legally enforceable one, to take care of that child until it is capable of taking care of itself.
Yes. Yeah, pretty straightforward there. It's interesting, too, because that's on the conservative side, I've been told in regard to abortion, and no, you shouldn't allow abortion because you should have to take responsibility for your actions, for having sex with a chance of becoming pregnant. Well, I said abortion is taking responsibility for your actions, like birth control or any other measures that you take. It is one of the rational things that one can do before you bring a person into the world. And of course, they don't like that. But we've had those discussions before about the time that Roe versus Wade was overturned. We had some great discussions. I'll link to those a little bit later. But on the same theme, somebody says, and this is kind of a long question, but you got to hear the whole thing because Leonard Peikoff will unpack it very easily. But how many times have you heard, if not this specific question, this kind of logic? I don't think parents should be obligated to provide an education for their children. By education, I mean the basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic. For example, it would be within the rights of a parent to raise a child on a farm and teach him farming, which presumably he could develop into a career. Now, I'm not saying this would be ideal, but it's within the parent's rights. My friend thinks that some form of schooling, including private, should be required by law. For example, if a child can't read a no trespassing sign, he may get killed. What do you say? Now, when I read this question, the first thing that stuck out for me was, for example, if the child can't read a no trespassing sign, he may get killed. At first, I thought, what on earth did you bring that example for? But now I realize
it seems like a pretty wild example. Most trespassing signs do not involve a reasonable expectation of being shot or something.
Right. But then I thought about, in the context of the kind of discussions I've heard, they're probably thinking, well, the founding fathers believed there should be a certain amount of education because otherwise you can't have a rights-respecting organized society. So yes, if you can't read, then you can't respect people's rights. You can't read their signs. I think that's what they were shooting for. There was that same idea that unfortunately we've had since the founding of, we've got to have a public education system because there's a bare minimum for, as if parents couldn't make that happen. Without a public education system. It's amazing.
Well, we expect parents to feed
now
and clothe the child. We don't expect them to educate the child. No, and send them to the doctor and pay for their vaccines and medical bill. Okay, no. It's part of the responsibilities of being a parent. You can't, no more than I could send my child's clothing bill to you, Robert. Do I have a right to send my child's education bill to you? But on the other hand, don't parents have an obligation to give their children minimum food and clothing? And so the question is this part of the obligation of a parent and a legally enforceable one, which is an interesting question.
Yes. Yeah, especially again, when we're going to cross the line from a moral obligation to a legal obligation. And I think Dr. Peikoff is on board with both of those. He says, well, I agree with your friend. I think it's the obligation of the parents to provide what you call the basics, the 3 R's. Otherwise, you are crippling his ability to function in the world, and that is an objective thing. You couldn't say the same thing about the study of literature or history or physics or any other subject. But if you don't have the rudiments of the ability to grasp and deal with concepts, you are reduced to a primitive preconceptual level, except for a few words. I believe a parent is responsible for enabling a child to become self-sustaining in an industrial society, enabling him in the most primitive terms. The government can't enforce any content. I don't think it can mandate even the right way of teaching reading or writing. But I think that someone who leaves the child to vegetate like a savage, like a wolf boy on a farm, has definitely violated the rights of the child. If they don't want to educate him, I think they should send him away, put him in an orphanage and let someone else adopt him. I think this kind of description of a parent would be monstrous. It amounts to turning the child into a serf, unquote. Now, you see why I mentioned there are people who want to claim the child is the property of the parents, with that implication of, I could educate him, I could not educate him. It's none of your business.
Could you starve them? Could you physically torture them? Could you neglect them so that they don't get the basic necessities of their physical existence?
Yeah. No, you could not. These kind of folks would divide it as, well, that's physical. But anything to do with...
when it comes to something like, we were just talking about Montessori schools, are you going to send your kid to a Catholic school or a Montessori school? How are you going to educate them? Private tutors? What will be involved? I mean, there's all kinds of value decisions the state should not get involved in with education. I'm very much opposed to public schools as such, and compulsory education of public schools as such. Now, is it part of a parent's general duty of care to give at least a basic education? Look, you allow them to be completely illiterate, so they can't even read a street sign, so they can't even sign their name to a contract? I mean, come on, at some point, a lack of education in our current context is simply child abuse, child neglect, in my view. So some minimum form of education, I think, should be required. Just as we would require minimal medical care, minimal feeding and clothing of the child, for example. But I'm not going to tell the parent, what fashion decisions, any more than I'm going to impose a set of ideas on how to educate the child either. That should be left to the parent and to private education. Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, again, I understand the arguments, because as soon as we say that the state has some ability to enforce the requirement to educate a child, now the state gets to decide what qualifies then as an education. It wasn't enough just to throw a reading book in his crib. I have to do a little more than that. So the state gets, I understand that it gets complicated, but so many people want to say, no, it shouldn't be complicated. Therefore, I have no obligation to educate my
Therefore, I
children.
have no obligation since it's complicated.
Sorry, some things
being
are complicated.
doesn't excuse the, and by the way, my wife grew up on a farm. She grew up, she woke up before dawn, milking the animals and getting the eggs out and doing her chores before dawn. But guess what? They also were able to send her to full-time school where she could learn reading and writing and arithmetic and history. It is, believe it or not, even on a farm, it is possible to give your kid a basic education other than farming.
Yes. That's why I bristle at the concept rugged individualism. I like the idea of individualism and I like the idea of being rugged. When you put those two together, it's almost permission to say, a hard Scrabble life where you had to make it on your own and nobody even taught you anything.
Yeah.
Or any of these distinctions people want to make that lets them say, I don't have to care about how complicated life is. Right. I don't have to actually have any good arguments other than you didn't knife me, you didn't non-initiation of force me, and therefore you violated my rights. And if that's not a subtle enough distinction, again, you as a lawyer understand the way in which rights are different with a 6-year-old and a 16-year-old and a 21-year-old. If that's not subtle enough, complicated enough distinctions, let me hit you with this last question. What, if anything, does a person owe his parents? Now, this has come up before, and so when I read this, it's like a big sandbag went boom right on the ground.
We've been talking about what parents owe kids, and people can, I think, see that much more straightforwardly. Here, the moral agents who can choose and think about it are actually the ones responsible for bringing this helpless being into existence. I think they can see the argument there. But when it comes to this one, it's a little more, since the parent is discharging their duty to raise you, at least in a minimal level, what about parents back to kids back to parents? Yeah. My mom is now in her 80s and she's facing certain health problems, but guess what? I'm now taking a certain lead role in helping her take care of herself now as she can. Is that my moral obligation to take care of mom? That's a really good question.
It is. It is. I know adult objectivists who are now caring for their elderly parents. And they understand that it's a choice, that they don't have a duty to sacrifice the next 10 years of their lives to this. And they've weighed it out and they've made that decision. I know other people for whom they haven't weighed it out. They're doing the exact same thing, but it feels like a burden and a duty. So let me read Leonard Peikoff's answer and see if we find some illumination here. Leonard Peikoff says, assuming decent parents, he owes them, so far as they have not maltreated him, respect. If they have in fact been good to him and helped foster his values, he should love them. You can't make love an obligation, but it would follow if they're those kind of parents. He should feel gratitude to them. He should be polite to them. Now you're trying to get me to say that when they're old, he owes them upkeep. No, he doesn't, because they are not breeding slaves. They're not breeding someone in order to look after them in their old age. Now, if he has the money and he loves them and it's not a sacrifice, great. But he does not owe his parents tit for tat financially. The same is true of any crisis that they go through. If they have treated him well, then in justice, he's positive toward them because they're of value to him. And if they're of value to him, then other things being equal, he's obligated to help them in a crisis. But it's the love that has to mediate it. And that has to be on a hierarchy. What other values are being threatened or lost in that process? It's much more of a one-way street. The parents owe more to the child than the child does to the parents because the parents made the choice to bring him into existence. He didn't. Now that's interesting to me because he acknowledges the difference, but he doesn't then wipe it out and say, no, you don't owe anything to your parents. There's no such thing as a duty. It's not duty.
It's not duty.
It's exactly the value that you have been given by your parents, assuming they, again, weren't abusive, weren't terrible parents, bringing you into the world and then getting you through the years in which you were helpless.
We started out by saying there can be no unchosen obligations. So in this sense, there is no obligation, a legally enforceable or morally, in my view, morally or legally enforceable obligation to the parent. And it is context sensitive. I was bringing up the child abuse cases that I prosecuted when I was with the district attorney's office. Obviously, in my view, those children do not owe anything to their parents at all. It is their parents who have done them wrong, and they should be able to feel anger and even hatred under the appropriate circumstances. An abused child learns, it's not an easy thing to hate your parents or to judge parents, because they were to some degree caregivers too, as well as abusers. But if you had really awful parents, do you owe them anything? No, sir. If they were abusive, quite the opposite. If they were responsible, good, decent, at least met their minimum obligation, then yeah, you do have a positive feeling and regard and respect for them. Now, in my case, I'll give you another example. I believe I had outstanding parents who went well above and beyond their moral responsibility. They wanted to do a bang-up job as parents, put a lot of thought and effort to it, and they followed through with their kids in very, very good ways. Now, so in that sense, I feel enormous gratitude for my parents. They didn't have to do all the things they did. Now, it's true, I didn't ask for it. It's not an unchosen obligation on my part, but it's just as if you were to do something really nice for me without my asking you to do so. I wouldn't feel obliged to do anything back because you just gave it to me without any conditions. On the other hand, would I feel so positively predisposed towards this nice thing you did for me that I would want in some way to acknowledge that and pay you back? Absolutely. So the gratitude for my parents, because they were really good parents, overflows. Now that they're getting older, I will reach out and help them and do what I can. And because of that, not because I owe it to them. And believe me, if it were on the other end of the spectrum and I didn't think they were really good parents, but really bad parents, I wouldn't feel any guilt, obligation, sense of duty, sense of owing them. I would be free to, in an extreme case, hate them under the appropriate circumstances. What a horrible thing to make your kid hate their own parent. It's not an easy psychological thing for anyone to have to do, but sometimes it's the appropriate thing. I'm angry at mom. I'm angry at dad. I hate them for the horrible thing they did for me. Believe me, in seeing horrible cases of child abuse, I've seen many, many cases that justify hating your parents. Now, that's going to sound really harsh, but it is for real. They have earned their child's hatred for life. They have damaged their child for life if they came out physically okay even. So no, there is no inherent obligation to your parents. A lot depends on context. You know, did they do you good? Did they do you bad? And in any case, it's not was never a chosen obligation on your part. So it's of a different order than the parent's responsibility to the child, morally speaking.
Yes. Outstanding. Before we wrap up, thanks again in the super chat. I'd love to see a little bit more of that super chat action, but thanks again to Walter Bishak for the super chat. If you are watching this YouTube video later, you'll see a super thanks option. You can still contribute to the Ayn Rand Center UK through a comment, through a super thanks that way. If you're not already a member of the Ayn Rand Center UK, there's a link right at the top of the chat, or just go to aynrandcenter.co.uk, click membership at the top, sign up. There are 4 different contributions. You can sign up at the Reardon Medal level, but even at the basic level of £9.99 a month, you can support the Ayn Rand Center UK. Thank you to those of you who already do, who are members of the YouTube channel as well. Thanks for that. Now, coming up, I was reading the headline. The headline says, Greta Thunberg arrested at German coal mine protest, will be freed later, police. So why'd they arrest her if they're just going to free her later? Not that I think she needs to be locked up forever for this protest, just long enough for it to mean something. Climate campaigner Greta Thunberg was detained with other activists during protests against the demolition of the German coal village of Lutzereif. I haven't heard this on audio, so I don't know how to pronounce that. But yeah, the entire group will be released later in the day according to, I don't even know what to think of that. But fortunately, I don't have to know what to think of it. I'll be told what to think of that in 70 minutes. If you stay on the Right Hand Center UK channel here, you can catch the Daily Objective coming up at 6 o'clock UK time, 1 o'clock Eastern. Guess that would be 10 o'clock your time, James, on the West
Yes.
Coast, the left coast, as some of us are fond of saying. So yes, Greta Gets Arrested, the Daily Objective number 674. Make sure you give that one a listen. James, I am the proud father. Again, my own daughter, Diana, she's my heart in another person's body. And so many great objectivist parents. We talked about some of the challenges of raising children and how do we figure out what their rights are at any given stage, their moral rights versus their political rights. And it can get complicated, it can get sticky. I knew you would have stories from your legal career, but I want to end on a happy note. If you are friends with any objectivist parents, folks, you know what I'm talking about. If you're not, but you're on the social networks, a lot of these folks are wide open and they will let you follow the adventures of their amazing children. If you're friends with the Caseys from Georgia or Molly Johnson and her kids, or, if you followed, of course, Kira Peikoff is now an adult, but if you've followed any of her career and her book releases, if you have followed, especially the Van Dams and the Batemans, these are like miracle children.
Yeah. There are just so many wonderful objectivist parents out there. As I say, most of my objectivist friends are parents. And if I could just leave on one thought, for years I participated in those Saturday night sessions at Leonard Peikoff's home back in the late 80s and 90s. And Kira, his daughter, was still just a little toddler at the time. And on those Saturday evening sessions, I would be the first person to arrive. I had the longest drive, so I would often be the first person to arrive at Leonard Peikoff's home. And he was still getting ready for the Saturday evening session. So he'd come to the door, "Can you watch Kira while I'm getting ready, Jim?" And so I would go to the Kira's play area, get on, sit Indian style and get on all fours and play with Kira for, say, the half hour before, as everyone else is arriving. And just watching Kira interact with her father, or watching Kira just play with her toys, was really an amazing thing. And I got a good insight into what an outstanding parent Leonard Peikoff was. And I could see, she probably doesn't remember these moments, but I could see from that moment that he was raising an independent, intelligent child, confident. Parenthood is an important task. When you do it right, you can set up a child like Kira for happiness and success and self-confidence. And that's what I saw. So if I can bring any of that kind of insight to this, I hope to. But you're absolutely right. Objectivist parents are some of the very best parents I have ever known, maybe the best.
Yeah, in the Substack post I mentioned, which you will read after this show, I know you will follow that link. Gina Gorlin posts, and her picture at the top, it's her with her newly born second child, her son, and a picture of the creation of Adam. And so I've been titling my comments on that, The Creation of Life, and it's exactly what it is. I was there when my daughter was born, and I know that feeling of, this is the single most valuable thing, just personally, completely personally and subjectively in the best sense of that word. It's the most amazing thing you can do. It's the creation of life. And so parenting, yes, is an enormous value. Anybody who's ever faced folks who say, yeah, objectivism doesn't get parenthood, objectivists don't appreciate parenthood, that is, in the past, I can see why we didn't have enough examples. Now we know better. That is completely and could not be more untrue. Those of you who are parents know exactly what I'm talking about. Those of you who have opted not for parenthood, I entirely respect that. There was a time in my life when I thought I would be a lifelong bachelor. So I get it and I appreciate it. James, you're an example of somebody who said, I've got things to do. That's not on the high value list. And I love that. I appreciate it. But having a child, so many great objectivist parents. Quick thank you to Vladimir Rusinov, who is in for 10. Let's see, what is BG? Well, doesn't matter what currency it is, but Bulgarian. So I'm guessing that Vladimir is in Bulgaria. But thank you for the super chat.
You.
Very much appreciate that contribution. Again, I love the objectivist parents out there. I love exploding that fallacy that objectivism doesn't take children or family into account.
And as a famous atheist in this world today, I just want to say that I will use that word again, sacred. I see good parents, whether it's Leonard Peikoff or my sister, raising kids. They're doing a sacred task. Just as I would regard devoting yourself to medicine or to science as a sacred task, so I would say that being a parent is a sacred task if human life is the standard of our values.
Yes. Oh, Bonnie.
Only do it for selfish reasons.
Yes.
Only do it for selfish reasons. That's what'll help make you a good parent. I don't see you being a good parent if you aren't doing it for selfish reasons. But with that caveat, it is one of the most, maybe the most important task, like up there with all the most important careers out there. So
it is an irreplaceable, not just an irreplaceable value, but an irreplaceable series of experiences. Bonnie in the chat says the Salmieri's, Greg Salmieri has been nice enough to share with us some of, he will play guitar and sing with his young child, and it's just the sweetest thing in the world. So yes, so many good objectivist parents, so much more to say, but this was great. Oh, Bonnie is also in with the super chat. Thank you for that, Bonnie. We appreciate your support.
We think it's on.
And James, I know you led into the conversation saying, well, I didn't have kids. I'm not sure I'm qualified to have this discussion, but your insights both on what you've seen from the objectivist parents and also what you've seen by virtue of the criminal justice system and when things go wrong, enormously valuable. Thank you for this. I very much appreciate that.
Thank you. Again, your wisdom and your experience, though, I'm going to be calling upon as we do a couple more episodes on parenthood. I'm not sure next week. We've got Valentine's Day coming up. We've got all kinds of other things coming up. We'll get back to more things about children, and I'm going to be relying on your experience there, sir.
Well, when we switch to Valentine's themes, I'm ready to give my experience on that too. But I know you've got easily as much to say about that as I do. Folks, thank you so much for following this discussion. I love especially the chat. I haven't read everything out loud, but I've been reading them all as they come in. Great discussion going on. I strongly encourage folks, if you listen after the fact, try to listen live on Wednesday mornings, 11 a.m. Eastern time, 4 o'clock UK, 8 a.m. on the West Coast, the left coast, because the chat is one of the funnest parts about doing this show. Great insights. We'll be back next week with more from Keeping It Real. James, thank you. Everybody listening, thank you. Don't forget to tune into the Daily Objective so we can find out what we should think about Greta getting arrested. Just kidding. But I am looking forward to those insights. It's going to be good. Thank you all.
Take care.
And good day.